Hey, good afternoon and welcome to our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Alex and today we'll be discussing data mining and deciphering twist logs. Apologies for the late start. I was just tying up a few loose ends here real quick with this. As luck happens, these things usually come together about 5 minutes before I start. This is part of our GoToWebinar series. If you're new to the series and you need to adjust the view of my screen, in the upper left-hand corner of the main GoToWebinar window, there is a zoom button you can use to either zoom in or zoom out, depending on if my screen is too large or too small for you. There is, in the main GoToWebinar control panel, there is a questions box where you can type any questions you may have. Typically we do questions at the end, but this is going to be an unusually information-dense webinar, so I want to make sure that you get at least the broad gist of what I'm showing. If you have any questions with what I'm showing during the session, just feel free to jump in, and if I lose too many people, I think Jude's going to come in and try and wrangle me in. As mentioned, this is part of our monthly Dalim webinar series. We do a webinar the third Wednesday of each month. So usually as soon as we know we're going to be doing for the next month, we'll put a notice up on our site. So be sure to keep an eye on that and keep an eye out for the emails. Also, I don't have a slide for it, but we do have Duo coming up at the end of next month in New Orleans. I don't think it's too late to get in on the special room right Dalim Head. I don't think it's too late to register, so hope to see you guys there. As mentioned, we'll be talking about data mining and deciphering of twist log files. This is one of those things that comes up time and time again where if you have files going through twist, it's usually invaluable to see what went on in the process log for a specific file. And the trick is that usually those are pretty ephemeral, so once a file finishes processing, you lose access to that log, and there's ways of getting that information by digging through twist log files, but that's a little hairy on its own. So I want to go through, first off, an overview of what those log files are, the different twist log files and their functions. I want to show you how you can use the ElasticStack to parse WFL server log entries and retain those twist process logs for later, either for data reporting purposes or for troubleshooting purposes, and how you can use Kibana visualizations to analyze those for trends and statistics. And I'll also touch a little on best practices for log data lifecycle management. If you're going to be sucking these into ElasticSearch, that's a lot of data to keep track of. So just to make sure you don't wind up stuffing a drive somewhere. This will be a little more information dense than our webinars typically are. This is kind of a weird scenario. I wound up building this because we have a few systems that we host for customers, and usually I wind up going half insane trying to dig through WFL server log myself. So I started poking around to see if this was possible. This requires a lot of compromises to get it running the way I wanted it to. So it's not a pristine example of the perfect LogStash or ElasticSearch config. So it's going to be very drilled down into what specifically this is doing. I am going to post on our help desk after this. I think at the end of the session I can also post handouts in here in GoToWebinar with copies of some of the codes that you have it. But once we finish recording this and put it up in YouTube, I'll have a copy of all the supporting materials on our help desk so that you can try this on your system if you want. Probably will require some tweaking to get it running the way you need it to. It's more or less just a proof of concept at this point. Since I said this is going to be a deep dive, if this is a topic you're interested in, I'm going to try and focus on the high-level understanding so you understand what it's doing, even if you don't understand the why of every little piece. If you want to see some more of the basics of those, we did do a Twisting Kibana basics webinar, I think about 2 years ago, where I built a few dashboards like this, which you had a little more control over what data we were pushing that way, but it required a little more manual config where you actually had to build that reporting into workflows. This is just going to pull information direct from the logs as they are without any extra needed intervention. Less flexible, but more useful. If you want to see some of those basics, you can go check out this webinar there. I also am going to be skipping over, for time reasons, a little information on some XML parsing I'm doing. This webinar isn't a one-to-one match to the link here, but I do discuss the sort of XML parsing I'm doing today in that webinar if you want to understand a little bit of the background on that. So, without further ado, one of those topics that comes up whenever we have Twist problems is Twist has a whole bunch of different log files for different services, and when something goes wrong, end users aren't always sure where they should look. So I wanted to try and just really quickly clarify how the different Twist components connect together and where each of those components logs. So the core of Twist is, if you're dealing with it, you're connecting through either the editor client or through a web browser to access Twist. Might also be connecting up through ES in some capacity. Those will be routed through the gate, and the gate's basically the front door where you can enter as an end user and see what's going on. That's what manages Twist's interaction with clients like Editor or WebLink in your web browser. You have under the hood the workflow server, which handles the actual running of the workflows. That's what handles the processes when files are going through. And then lastly, you have the repository, which is just a store that archives where all the master copies of each workflow. So typically, as far as the logging here, the repository log is symlinx.var 6.0 log twist rserver.log. Typically, the only time you really need to look at that is if you're having an issue with one of your Twist servers not being able to connect to a repository or not being able to sync workflows for some reasons. For the Twist gate that is in wifflegate.log, it's another one you probably won't need to look at too often. That will mainly be if you're having issues where no one can log into Twist, for example. WebLink gets logged into Catalina.out. Which, if you come from the ES side of things, that's sort of backwards. Of ES, we always look at Catalina.out because we're dealing with the output of that web app. Here, we're only concerned with that if we're dealing with WebLink. And then the core of Twist logging is wiffleserver.log, which is buried in symlinx.var 6.0 log twist, the name of whatever the Twist host is, and then wiffleserver.log. Now, hopefully this is going to show up okay for the screen share here. I tried to color code this a little bit. So wiffleserver.log, and I think I actually have a live one here I can open too. It's basically just a stream of everything that is going on in Twist in that workflow server. There's two things it tends to log. There's these messages here where start with either an M or L. Those are just overall statuses about the health of the workflow server. Usually you don't need to worry about them unless something goes wrong. They're usually not information you need to be too concerned about. There are also these lines that begin with log. These are the ones that we're interested in because those lines are related to the Twist process log. So I can see here that each of these has all the information I'm getting in the Twist process log. They have the workflow name. There's the Twist host name that the file ran on. There is the process ID number. There is the tool nickname if it has one. The tool name, the name of the file running through whatever step, and then whatever message is associated with that log. These are stored on per individual line of the log. So there's separate entries in wiffleserver log for example, for this OPDF, for the start, for the PDF output succeeded message, for the done message in here. Those are all logged separately. And it wouldn't be too bad to read if this log weren't interleaved. If you're looking at this log file, you're going to see output from all different files interleaved, so you won't see all these messages in order, which you can usually piece together if you need to find out what happened, like why a file failed in the workflow. You can dig through and find out why it happened, but it's a little messy to do. So what would be nice is if there was a way we could parse these, combine them back into a standard combined log like this for each tool, and then have a way to search that or mine that for data for reporting purposes later on, which is where the ElasticStack comes into play. There are two main components to the ElasticStack. The first is ElasticSearch, which is an indexing or search database. It started, Dalim's involvement started with it. If you've ever used ES, Dalim uses ElasticSearch as the underlying search engine. So if you have a file stored in your ES system, you can use ElasticSearch to, when you run a search in ES and look for a file, that's what it's using under the hood to find it. There is also another component of that ElasticStack called Kibana, and Kibana is a just graphical front end that you can use to view things in, you can view the records in Elasticsearch or create visualizations. It's a way of interfacing with Elasticsearch if you're not doing it at the low level kind of API way, so that you can just do it from a web browser. So at a high level, what we're looking for here is we're going to take Wiffle server log, push it into Elasticsearch, and have it set up in a way that we can then go in with the web browser and view entries or build reports in Kibana. But so let me see here. What do I want to do?
Come on.
Sorry, what was that, Mike? But so there's two other segments in here too, though. If we're dealing with the full process, because if we were to push this file directly into Elasticsearch, parse it somehow, we need some way of getting it in, tracking when new lines have been added to this file, and then somehow merging them back into a common tool log from those individual records. So that's where it comes in. There are two other parts of the Elasticsearch stack that we'll be dealing with. The first is called FileBeat, and FileBeat is a log shipping application. So FileBeat would be something, a little utility you had installed on your Twist server. And what that would do is that would be configured to watch wiffleserver.log for updates. And whenever it sees an update, then it would pass that on to LogStash. LogStash is a log parsing and routing utility. So we could manipulate this data rather than just sending one of these raw ugly log lines direct to Elasticsearch. We can break it apart and digest the different chunks we're interested in, and then convert them into something that's a little more usable to the end user. So as far as, maybe I think the best way to go from here is I'll do a quick demo to show you what I'm talking about here, and then we can delve into the under the hood. So I have here, if you've never played with, I see we do have some people on the call who've used ES. We have some Twist-only people as well. So as far as a basic overview, this is the Kibana interface. It's showing me all records I have related to my Wiffle server log within the past 60 days right now. Everything is time-based in here. And if I scroll down, I can just see all these entries that I have for different things. If I click on any of these, then I can expand it to see what fields I have associated with this particular log entry. So I can see in this particular entry, actually that's not too great a one to play with. Let me scroll down a little more here. I think I got a more exciting one. Here we go. So I have one here. You can see that I have, these are the fields that I busted out of that Wiffle server log. So we're getting back to the process log sort of thing where I have the tool end time. I have the duration the tool took. I should have start time down here. Yeah, it's alphabetical. And I can see, for example, this is a show memories tool. It took about 1/10 of a second to run. This was the output of the process log for that show memories tool. And it completed okay. It didn't complete with an error. It ran in this workflow X1A tester. Now, if I want to view this, and then this isn't the most user-friendly way to view things just like this. What I can do for any of these events in here is I can click on these little icons here to say I want to see that column in this table here. So I can look at what I'm interested in. Maybe I want to see what the process ID is. Maybe I want to see what the tool name is. I can click on those and build a table out this way. So if I actually open, I have a saved one here, so you don't have to watch me clicking those things a million times. They can configure the way I want. But here's an example of more of a traditional sort of process log. So I can see for all the files that have been running through my system. We have here a program link that failed after show memory step. We have a show memory step for a file. And right now this is just a pool for all different files that have been going through my system. So this isn't zeroed in any one file. It's just showing me the most recent log entries for tools that have been happening on my system. So we can see we got some bypass power traps there, a few PS checks. If I wanted to drill down and see what's going on with one of these files, I could say that I want to filter on this and see any entries related to Alex's totally unique file to filter and see just for that. In this case, it looks like that's a PGS file, so let's do it this way. We'll do, if I want to see anything for file name, and I'll do a wildcard at the end because I want to see maybe, let me copy that. Maybe a unique file name, but it is not as memorable as I need it to be right now. Paste this in. And I can see all hits for this file, so I can see what happened for maybe a specific process ID in here, so I can see it came in. Actually, if we flip the time around here, so we start with the oldest entry, I can see this file came in. It went through a set prem from RE in my workflow. It went through a node, and actually I think I have that workflow open right now over here too. If I go to X18 tester. So I can see that it went through all the steps of my workflow with the input files. It went through a set prem from RE. It went through a node, and it bypassed an ICC conversion step. I went through a PS check, a power trap, OPDF, so on, before it failed in my programmed link. So that's an example of if I wanted to view these things and just see, for example, I had a file that failed the other day, or I got a complaint from someone, and I want to see what happened for it. I can very easily pull up historical records without having to dig through Wiffle server log for individual lines and then piece them back together and deal with the XML. It's much cleaner to read this way. The other thing this is useful for is you can create visualizations based off this data. I did run out of time here, so I don't have super fancy ones, but I did have two quick examples I can show you of where this might be useful. The first one here is I have a breakdown of files based on workflow and hosts. And this is going to show me within the time period I have set here, so last 60 days. You can set that to whatever you want if you want to narrow in on a specific period for different view of that data. It'll show me a breakdown of what workflow my files have run through and how many files that workflow has processed. And this should update live, so I think I have my, where's my editor here? I need to run a few more files through here. I really did lose my editor window here. Oh, it's hiding over there on my other screen. So that was at 9 for the one server I have, and 5 files ran in that workflow on the other server. Let me go ahead and let's drag in. We'll put that one in. I think that one will crash my server. I'll put a few in. I have another copy of this workflow. This one's set to deliberately fail because I was testing that. So there's a bad program link at the end. I have another one that's not broken here, so I'll try that just to make things more interesting, and I'll drag files into a few other workflows just for the heck of it too. So let's see here. We have those cooking. Was this anything good? Yep. Stick something in there, why not? And sure, why not? That one as well. And then when I go and refresh this view, we should have an updated count. So you can see more workflows coming in. We can see that we have records for how many files went through each of these on each different server as far as a breakdown by server. So what I'm doing is I'm doing a count metric to see how many first files went through, how many files were processed through a specific workflow, and then I'm breaking that down a little further in to see how many files processed per workflow per host is another sub bucket there. But yeah, those are updating live based on the time period I chose. So if you need to see stats for like a certain week for reporting purposes, you can do that. I think Fred's done a few other webinars that delve into the bones of building these visualizations. I did build one other quick table in here where I can see rejected processes per workflow. So I can see how many files were rejected in each of these workflows here. And if I change that time period to, for example, the last 15 minutes, you'll see that that count goes down for this. You can also do like charts and like bar charts, pie charts, line charts. I don't, unfortunately, run out of time to come up with any super fancy examples of those right now. But if you're interested, I can get you links to a few of the webinars Fred's done on that in the past. But that's the basic gist of how this might be useful within Kibana. So I think after that, I'll delve a little into the back end of how this is set up, so you have an idea of how this works. So if you want to get ElasticSearch on your system, you have a few options. First off, if you're using not just Twist, you're using ES as well. ES does, since version 5.0, use ElasticSearch under the hood for search. If you're using ES 5.0, that comes with ElasticSearch 2.2 and Kibana 4.5. ES 5.5 comes with ElasticSearch and Kibana 5.5. And ES6 will be coming with ElasticSearch and Kibana 6.5. As far as how this works out, you can use, for any of these versions, you can use, if you're using this with ES, you can also use newer versions within the same series, as long as you stay within, for example, that 5.0 point level for ES 5.5 and ElasticSearch 6x for ES 6.0. Dalim's implementation there is tied to that version. There is an ElasticSearch and Kibana 7 out now too. I haven't had a chance to play with it too much myself yet. I don't think Dalim has plans to support it in ES 6.0 yet. If you're doing this with just Twist, if you're using just Twist and you want a Kibana and ElasticSearch installed to play with, I would say go with either 6 or 7, get the latest and greatest. Specifically because in some of the older versions of ElasticSearch, the password protection of ElasticSearch and Kibana was a paid feature. So you had to pay them for the ability to lock it down, so that people had to log in to view Kibana, for example. But as of, I think it's ElasticSearch 6.3 or 6.4, that's one of the free features where you can lock that down. And on the Dalim side, ES has support for that lockdown as of ES 6. But the examples I did today, I tested against ElasticSearch 5 and 6. It works well with both of those. If you're still in ES 5.0, I don't know how well these will work with the ElasticSearch 2. It sort of works with ElasticSearch 7, but I need to do a little more testing with that. But yeah, if you don't have an ES install and you're using Twist, you can install whatever version you want and roll with it that way. So you can either download the latest RPMs from their website there, or you can install their repo by importing their key, then adding in this file etsy.repos.d elasticsearch.repo. Yeah, you can add these lines, for example, for Elasticsearch 6. Just change those 6s to a 7 for Elasticsearch 7, and then you can use yum to install whatever components you need on that particular machine. If you're doing this as a new install, I don't want to delve too much into the basics of installing, but if you're installing this new outside of ES, you should add these two lines to Etsy Kibana.yml and Etsy Elasticsearch.yml. And this will basically allow you, if you have like a separate Elasticsearch and Kibana server, this tells it to bind to all network addresses so that your Twist server can hit it. If you're just installing Elasticsearch and Kibana directly on the Twist server itself, you wouldn't need to add those lines because you could just hit it on localhost. You see, we did just have a question come in. The data I'm grabbing, is it possible to see load on each server? Desire would be to see load across a timeline to identify when we have too much or not enough horsepower. Yeah, that should be possible. I ran out of time on the demonstrations in Kibana, but it should be possible to graph out the load over time. I did have an example kind of like that when I did this 2 years ago, which is lost with some VM long gone, but at that time I did have an aggregation of some kind to map out files processed per minute. It should be possible with the information we're getting out of wiffleserver.log to map that out. And you can see a little of that in here if you just do a search. If I go back to Kibana real quick, I can do yeah, because this shows me if I go to last 60 days. Actually, that's too wide to get a good graph. Let's do last 12 hours. I can see a breakdown of how many events I'm logging. I guess if I wanted to see the load, because that's the trade-off if you're parsing from a log like this, is you don't have as much flexibility as if you're pushing your own data in for like the specific end of a process. But I think if you searched for, like in this particular case, tool type input files, so if you're trying to see like how many files are being ingested, you could drill in here and get a chart of some kind or a histogram of some kind showing you how many files were ingested at a certain point. But I think that for that question, it depends how much load you have coming in, or what you define as, what you consider as load. But the information's here. You should be able to build something that fits your needs there. I'll sneak back here. You're trying to get those questions as they come in, because I know it's a lot of stuff I'm going to be covering here. So once you've got Elasticsearch installed, the next part of this is FileBeat. You have the choice of either putting Elasticsearch and Kibana and everything on your Twist server or keeping it separate, which I would recommend. But for this case, whatever machine you have the log on, FileBeat is a little utility that has to go in there. And as part of that, you have to tell it what files you want it to track. So in this particular case, I am adding I would have this on my Twist server. I have what they call prospectors. I think this changed in Elasticsearch, in FileBeat 7, in Elasticsearch 7, they changed it to input. So if you're testing on that version, you need to tweak that line to get it to work. But I'm defining the input type as a log. For this particular input type, I'm giving it this one path. This does support wildcards, so I could hypothetically just type a star in there and get every log under that path. I wasn't sure I wanted to do that here because Twist rotates these logs, so after a log gets so big or lasts so many days, it moves it into another file name, so that wiffleserver.log is always the current one. I didn't want to wildcard this because I was worried it would try pulling in some of that old data a second time. You also have to define, because these are multi-line log files in cases, you have some entries in here. I think I can find one pretty quickly where here's one. So here's something where you've got multiple lines and you need to know where one event starts and ends. So what I did here is to define a multi-line pattern that, in this case, I'm just looking to see if it begins with a less than sign or like a bracket for my tag for my XML. And I'm saying that that's the start of my multi-line pattern. My multi-line match says everything after that I encounter one of these is part of that event, and then it's negated the next time it runs into another of these. So it would see this as the start, it would keep going until it found another thing that matched, and then it would consider that the next line and then continue on. So this one would be one line because it would stop when it saw the next tag there at the beginning of the next line. There are other options for these in the Elasticsearch documentation if you're dealing with different types of log files and need a different format. As part of this, once things get pulled in this way, I'm applying a tag called wiffleserver.log, wiffleserver.log, because inside of LogStash, I need tags to help route things. So, and then from there, I'm outputting it to LogStash to do further parsing. So, for the next step here, we have things from FileBeat to LogStash. With LogStash, one config we need to make in etc logstash, logstash.yml. For this particular implementation, to change the pipeline workers to 1. I'm going to come back to why that is a little later, but that's generally not a recommended setting, but it's something we need to do to deal with Dalim's log format. You can build different config files to handle different input into LogStash. Anything you get placed into this directory will be picked up and used by LogStash to evaluate and parse those logs. This can also be used if you don't want to, if you're testing and trying to write one of the config files and get it working. You can also launch LogStash via the command line directly, just to test it and see what it's going to do, and before you actually set it up and have it run kind of headless as a service. I will mention too, if you're doing this with, you're using ES5.5 and you're using LogStash 5x along with that, there is a known bug in that version with the XML filter we use as part of this. So in order to deal with that, you need to go into this file, user share LogStash gem file, and edit this line. This is a XML parsing utility it uses under the hood, and tell it to use version 1.8.5, and then run this command to tell it to downgrade to this version of this plugin. Otherwise, there was some issue with that not checking a dependency or some kind of dependency conflict, and I couldn't get it parsing XML correctly until I did that. So our flow again is we have wiffleserver.log, FileBeat's monitoring that file for new lines. As it sees them come in, it's shipping them to LogStash. LogStash is then breaking apart the different components we care about and pushing them into Elasticsearch. And then from there, we can use Kibana to view those like we were a few minutes ago. Now within LogStash, there's 3 main steps we need to go through. Input, filtering, and output. And LogStash is a utility made by the Elasticsearch people, but it's by no means limited to just Elasticsearch. For each of these steps, you can choose different plugins to do different things. So you can have input that comes from FileBeat like we're doing. You can have input that comes from standard input on a command line. You can have input that gets curled to some HTTP port somewhere, whatever you want there. Then those get passed into a filter section where you're manipulating the data. So mutate, for example, is a tool that's used to change, mutate is used to like rename or alter fields if you want to like change the data a bit, like an XML filter to pull data out of one field that's XML and break it apart into different pieces. Grok, which is basically like a regular expression sort of thing where you can pull different chunks out of a larger variable, and then outputting to some location, which could be Elasticsearch like we're doing, could be standard output in a command line. There is a Nagios plugin, so for example, if you saw something you didn't like in one of these logs, you could set off a Nagios alert, have LogStash pass a alert to Nagios so that you get emailed that something's broken somewhere in your system. I do want to play with that on the ES side someday, but outside of the scope of this webinar. And I did see there's not an official one, but there is a third-party plugin I saw for outputting from LogStash to SQL databases. So hypothetically, you could have this dump rather than dumping the log data we're gathering into Elasticsearch, have it dump it into some existing database somewhere for you. So the LogStash config we're talking about there, we've got our different sections, input. In this case, the most simple config you could do, we have input coming in, just being pulled in from standard in. We're not doing anything special with it. It just receives and accepts all data from standard in. And then we have output here, and this output is outputting just directly to standard out using a codec called Ruby debug to show us, to make the information display a little prettier. So just as a quick example here, I have a copy of a config like that on my machine. Give me one sec here, actually, let me pull it up. Here we go. So here's a copy of that base config I have on my server itself. I'm going to pull up a terminal on my server. And I'm actually going to stop the running copy of LogStash I have that's currently watching Twist because I don't want these to interfere with each other. And this time I'm going to call it directly from the command line. So user share. I'll make this a little bigger too so it's readable. So user share LogStash bin. I'm going to use the worker1 command here. And I'm going to point it to a file I have in this directory called o1minimal.com. And when this starts up, anything I type on the standard output is just going to parrot back at me. I guess it's going to take a minute to start up on me, isn't it? But you could, for example, change this if you wanted to send it to Elasticsearch instead. You could change it to say Elasticsearch and then put like the server name and stuff in here to send to that instead. But yep, it looks like it's up and running. So it's still finishing booting. There we go. Yep. So it's outputting whatever I type. It's just outputting directly to the command line. And if I wanted to send it a line from Twist, it's not going to be too useful. It's just going to give me the, I think I have one for OPDF somewhere here. Here's a decent line I can use. So if I take one of these lines and dump it in, it's not going to do anything too useful there. Because I can push it to Elasticsearch, but it's the same log line that's kind of ugly to look at. So what I'll do instead is I have a second log or second configuration here that's the very basic start of getting this parsed into a more readable format. So we're still dealing on, and let me start this before I go over this because otherwise I'll just be waiting for it to boot up. So while that's cooking, it's again going to accept anything on standard input, so anything I paste into my terminal. But this time what it's going to do is we have a filter section here, which is where we're going to manipulate that data and push it into a somewhat more readable format. So we're starting with this XML filter here. I'm not going to delve too much into the specifics for time reasons, but what it's doing is it's going through this file, and it's parsing out each of these things. So the file name, for example, here, the date that the log is timestamped with, all that information, the text of the log itself in here, and it's going to put those in their own fields. Now we need to do one more line of cleanup after that, because Dalim has a habit of, this is decent XML, but there's this entry here that has the workflow name, the server name, the process ID, and the tool name all kind of sandwiched into one field. And even if we break this apart, that's still kind of messy. So what I'd have here is a second round of filtering called grok. And this is basically just a shorthand regular expression kind of thing. Again, I'm not going to delve too into the specifics for time reasons. But what I'm doing is I'm taking that string that's here and defining what it looks like and telling it to grab certain things out of here where each of these from certain points. So after the period here, grab the workflow name. Then after the next period and before the comma, grab the server name, and so on, to split those into their own fields. Now, if it fails this parsing process, it's probably one of these other like just status lines that we don't care about. So we'll just tell it to go ahead and drop that event because we don't want it. So, yep, this is up and running now. So if I were to take, for example, this line here, no pre-flight applied, from this PS check, you can see that now it went through, it did that filtering, and it busted that raw data into all these separate fields, which is what we were pushing into open my save search. That's breaking that apart into all those separate fields that we were pushing into ElasticSearch before. So that's a little better to deal with, but it's still one line at a time. Because if I keep putting in other lines, I'm just going to get more formatted information, but it's still just one line at a time, which if you want to find out why a PS check errored out, you don't want to have to find every single line from that PS check separately. So that's where the next step of this comes in, is figure out what we need to grab in here. What are all the cases we need to deal with in this config? So our options are, what do we need to grab is the start of multi-line log entries. Most of these, whenever you have one of those lines that spans multiple entries that spans multiple lines, Dalim tends to put a start message of some kind at the beginning. Sometimes it's capital, sometimes it's lowercase, sometimes it's start with, but it's generally formatted like that. We might have entries that are the middle of multi-line entries, so they're part of some larger log entry, but they're not the beginning or end. So like anything in between the start and done here. Then we've got the end of multi-line log entries. There's usually a very clear done or some kind of error message at the end of a line to let us know when it's done, because we need to know when they start and when they end in order to combine them back into one log entry. Then we also have a few single line logs that don't need to be merged back together. And those include the job status message that shows up at the end of every workflow. It always says job completed successfully, job rejected by workflow engine, something like that. Errors in program links are another special case we got to keep in mind because sometimes These tend to get piggybacked if you actually look at a twist log and there's a bad program link in there. So something like that, it's not going to complete. Something goes wrong in one of your program links in a workflow. It just, actually that's one that failed because of transmit. Here's one that failed because of my link. So even though this didn't fail in show memories, it tends to get logged as an error under show memories, which isn't always the clearest. So that's another case we want to deal with is programmed links and how we can separate those out into their own separate message. And then lastly, bypass tools that just have a message saying bypassing whatever the tool name is. So in order to deal with this, we're going to need to use something called an aggregation. And an aggregation is basically, it's like a temporary store where you can put data to keep track of certain things over the course of multiple log lines, so that when some event ends, you can cache out, you can grab all that stored data, and then push that with the final event in a series. So how this would wind up working just as a very simple kind of flowchart, a little different from how we're going to implement it, but the general idea is we get a log line in from FileBeat. We go through an initial parsing phase where we extract and sanitize the log data, sort of like what we're doing in the last example. We move on to sorting then. First check, for example, is this the start of a multi-line log entry? If it is, then we create an aggregation to track that log entry over the multiple lines it takes to run. And we start by copying that line's contents into that aggregate log. And then we drop that line because we're not interested. We only need to know the completed log at the end of this process. If it's the middle of a multi-line log entry, then we just append this line to that running process log in the aggregation and drop that line. And at the end of a multi-line log entry, we cache out that aggregation. We say we've got all the data we need. We pull all the log info we temporarily stored in that aggregation, and we push that as part of the end event when that tool is finished running in Twist. Then for anything that's either a job status, program link error, or bypass tool, we just pass that on to the processing step right away. So the only things that are getting passed on to our next step are the completed process log that's been aggregated at the end of that whole process, and then these three different types of individual logs here that are only like one line each. Then at post-processing, we set an overall tool status just to tell us whether or not that step completed successfully, clean and standardize the fields a little, and then send it to Elasticsearch. And then there's the slightly, and I know we're running low on time, this isn't going to be too much longer, I don't think. I don't expect you can probably read this slide from the Zoom it's at, so I have a few other blow-ups of it, but let me pull up. I have, again, it's the same three steps. This is just everything I'm doing in my actual config file. And so we went through those two basic configs I was showing you earlier. Where is my text editor hiding on me? Oh, here it is. So we went through those two basic configs. The first one where LogStash just spit input back out, and the second one where we did a little more filtering to break out those values. Now, I have one more that's kind of the full Monty we're going with. So I'll go to my desktop. I have this in Final Config. And I'll post a copy of this in our help desk, and I think when this ends, I can add it as an attachment real quick so that you guys can download it and test it on your server if you want to play with this. My hope is that even if you don't understand all the nitty-gritty of this, you understand the big picture and can hook it up if it's something you want to experiment with or that would be of use to you. So our process here, let me move that to a new window because I don't like having that sidebar there. So our full process, we start with this initial parsing step. So we have things coming in. They're coming in from FileBeats, is sending us WFL server log lines as it finds them. We have a filter here. I did add, because we're tagging that when we send this from FileBeats, I'm adding this if WFL server log and tags condition here because LogStash tends to group all these filters together. If you don't specify that a filter is only for a specific tag, then everything's going to get run through it. So if you had a case where you were also parsing Tomcat logs with this, or you had some other logs for third-party application, this helps keep those filtering separate. It keeps separate filtering processes for each of those. So I have this wrapped in conditional here. We have the same parsing we just did for the XML, so we're grabbing the log data. We're doing that additional processing in Grok where we split out the workflow name, server name, process ID, and tool name into their own variables like we were doing in that last example. Again, dropping, if something doesn't match this, it's probably another log line related to server health that we're not interested about in this context, so we'll drop it. Now, because the Grok setup up here, it looks for, not every tool has a nickname. Some of them have, they're just OPDF. You might have a OPDF that's just named OPDF. It doesn't necessarily have a nickname associated like X1A PDF or something. So this is set to only grab the tool type if that field is listed there. If it doesn't have an entry for that, then we know that the tool doesn't have a nickname. So we can just copy the tool name into the tool type field. So those are both populated. There is a date filter here that converts Dalim's timestamps from milliseconds to, like we have here, into a proper timestamp that's a little more human readable. And that's pretty much the initial parsing phase there. The next step is the sorting phase. So we start with this one. We actually have to start with the end of the aggregation, so I'll skip this one and come back to it. So we check to see, is it a job status log entry that's returned at the end of the workflow. We have a condition here for this. And this is basically looking for, if it finds a line that matches that, it sets the status based on the message the job reported. So if it completed successfully, we add a field to this entry saying that the status is completed. If it failed, then we add a message saying status error based on this. If it was deleted, we add a status saying that it was deleted. We're also adding a tag here called one-line log for post-processing, just because these contain a different, these are going to have different fields associated with them at this point in the game. For anything that is an error in a link, so an error condition, we're editing the tool name to signify that it's program link after the tool rather than that specific tool, and just so that I have Firefox is hiding on me. So that way, if I come in here, it says that when it sends the event, it says that it's an error in the program link after sendmail rather than an error in sendmail itself, so that it's a little clearer in the logs. And we'll add the status as error, and again, tag it as a one-line log for further post-processing. Then lastly, bypass tools in here. If a tool is bypassed, then we just set the status to bypassed and pass it on as a one-line log. Then if it doesn't meet any of these conditions, then we know it's either the start or the middle of a multi-line log entry. So what we have to do then is we have to create our aggregate. So what we do is with an aggregate filter in here, we need some field that we can use, some kind of task ID we can use to group the aggregate. In this case, it's that combined tool name, server name, process ID, tool name that we have here. I just pass it that variable because you're never going to have a process ID with two steps running at the same time. So that's our unique identifier we use to combine those back into a single log entry. So what I have in here is I have this line here. We're using that to group our aggregates. We have some Ruby code in here that what this is going to do is it's going to map. It's going to create a process log variable in our aggregate, just as temporary storage, and we're going to make that a new string if it's not already initialized. So if this is the first entry to come in, then for this aggregate, then it's going to create a new process log. It's also going to, if it's a new entry, add the time from the current log as the start time for this step. And it's going to, in any case, whether it's the beginning or middle of a process log, it's going to copy its own line into that specific log line from here into the full aggregate log. There is also, and I didn't want to cite, I got this from, there's a Stack Exchange thread. I don't think I would have figured this out on my own. LogStash is a little iffy with handling new lines, so we just need to add the 10 character is the new line character. So we're just adding that after the log line to add a new line after each log line we add to the process log, so we don't have just some long thing stretching across the stream. So that's where I grabbed that from. And the map action here is set to create or update. So that says if this is the first thing with this identifier to hit this step, then create the new aggregate and go through these two lines to initialize the process log and start time. If not, then it'll just ignore those. So the one thing I did say I would come back to is the end of a multi-line log entry. So we go back up to the beginning here. And the done event here, what we do then is we're again based off the same aggregate with the task ID. We're renaming the timestamp for this log line to be the end time of the tool because we know the tool is done because it either completed successfully or it failed for some reason. I did have to put one kludge in here for the show memories tool, since that's the one tool I've seen that doesn't end with some kind of done message. So that's why this is in here. You've got, for most tools that complete successfully, this should catch. For show memory specifically, we've got that. These two should catch any tools that errored because those are technically the end of a tool too. It completed, it just didn't complete successfully. But the aggregate, we're doing it again off that string here as our ID. What we're going to do then is we're going to cache out and take that completed process log from the aggregate, and we're going to save that as a field or variable in this current event, this end event. We're also going to pull the start time from that aggregate where we temporarily stored it and pull it into this end event. Then we're also going to calculate, just for if you wanted to see how long the tool took, like a duration, to see if, for example, PS check's taking longer in a certain workflow than others, we're calculating a duration. It looks like in Ruby you can just subtract one time from another. So we can subtract the start time from the end time, and it'll return a result in seconds. As far as citing, I got that from this thread here too. I thought that was pretty slick. So, and we're also checking to see if it completed successfully or not, and setting either the status to completed or errored based on that. And from there, it's going to go on to post-processing. So the last step, now we've got our completed aggregate log entries. We've got our single line log entries. It's going to do a check down here to see if, we're down here. If it's a one-line log, then we don't have some of the same values we set earlier when we combined those multi-line entries. So it doesn't have like a process log variable, for example. I have a bit of code here that just renames the log line to variable to process log. Since we only have one line, we're just renaming it, and renames the log's timestamp to be a start time field so it matches the multi-line log entries. This doesn't work in LogStash 5x if you're using that version with ES55, but there is an option here. If you wanted to have a start time and end time for all steps, you could copy the one-line log entries here. You could just copy the start time into the end time. This will work with Elasticsearch 6, which I'm testing now, but if you're using an older version, then it's not going to help you. So I just have that commented out. And then we're also removing a few unneeded fields here at the end before pushing all these events. So when FileBeat pulls things in, or when LogStash does things to them, it adds fields of its own. So it has the messages, the full unfiltered XML. We don't want to pass that on to Elasticsearch and Kibana because it's not useful to us. Version is some identifier that I think FileBeat adds to these. We don't really care about that because it's always going to be 1 in our case. So we can just use the mutate filter here to remove those, just so that the results are a little cleaner. Now the last thing in here is the output. So if process log XML is in our tags, then we'll send it to this Elasticsearch server. And we'll store it in an index named after Wiffle server and then the year and the month in this case, so that any log entries from Wiffle server log that it pushes from this February, for example, will get stored in a February 2019 or 2020 index, so that then when it goes to March, it'll make a new one. I can query those all in Elasticsearch because when or Kibana, because I have this set up so that when I'm searching for any indexes that have data that start with Wiffle server. So I can have differently named indexes in here, and it makes it a little easier later on if I need to clean out old data. I don't want to keep this in there until the end of time. If I get to a point where maybe I don't need it after 6 months or a year, I can clean out that old data just by deleting that one specific index for a month that I don't care about anymore. So that's pretty much the gist of how this is set up. So let me see real quick if I can send you on here the files so you can play around with this if you want. And then we can take questions if you have any. So let me see here. I had a few files. I think I can add them as handouts on this. So I'm going to drag and drop in these 2 files. These were the 2 basic configs. Desktop. I doesn't look like I can add that as a handout. I'll put it up on our help desk. If you don't have access to our help desk and you want to just drop us a line at text@Blanchard, and I can get you a copy of it. But you'll probably have that up on our help desk tomorrow when we put up the video on YouTube. So with that, does anyone have any questions about this, or? I think I scared everyone away. So if you have any questions, you can always drop me a line later too. But there's a little bit of a fire hose today. I have a lot more info than I usually try to delve into webinars. But I thought this particular use case could be beneficial to you. So I thought I'd explain a little about how this works, and I'll give you the code that you can use to try playing with this if you want to test this on your server. So thank you for joining.
Alex, there is one question here.
Is there one?
Yeah, the question is, with the data you're grabbing, is it possible to see load on each server? The desire would be to see this load across a timeline to identify when we have too much or not enough horsepower across various twist servers.
Yeah, I caught that one a little bit ago when it came in. I answered it at the beginning.
Okay.
But yeah, the answer is you could. I just didn't have time once I got all this config working for this to actually build a timeline. But if you go into Kibana, you can see here just in the basic view, I can see a histogram of when things came in. So this is just showing me all events I have in the system, regardless of what tool they're associated with. If I wanted to filter that, because that's the trade-off of the webinar we did 2 years ago that I linked to at the beginning. Where's that? That might be a better one-to-one fit for what you're looking for. is I had a webinar 2 years ago, I think, where we, at the end of a Twist workflow, Twist manually pushed a report to Elasticsearch on how that process went, whether it succeeded or whether it failed. You had a little more control over that info in this case, where I could build a nice chart. But something like this should be possible with this as well. You just might not have as much flexibility. But I guess if I did file, tool type input files would show me how many files I have coming into Twist. And you should be able to do a visualization based off something like that. So, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So, thank you all for joining. I hope to see you guys in Duo in another month. Have a good one.